There was a moment in the autumn of 1907 when the financial system of the United States stopped functioning. Banks were collapsing. The stock market was in freefall. The U.S. Treasury did not have the legal authority, the cash reserves, or the institutional capacity to intervene at the scale the crisis required. So the U.S. government did the only thing it could do. It went to one man's house. For 3 weeks, in a private library on Madison Avenue in New York, the most powerful financiers in America sat behind locked doors at the personal invitation of a 70-year-old banker with a famously disfigured nose and a reputation for terrifying everyone he negotiated with. He decided which banks would be saved. He decided which would be allowed to fail. He decided how much money would be put up and by whom. The Secretary of the Treasury sat in an adjacent room and waited for instructions. The man's name was J.P. Morgan, and for a brief, extraordinary period in American history, he was, in every meaningful sense, the central bank of the United States. This is the story of the Morgans, the family that became more powerful than the government they lived under, and what happened when the country finally decided that no private citizen could ever be allowed to be that powerful again. The Morgan story does not begin with J.P. Morgan. It begins with his father. Junius Spencer Morgan was a Hartford merchant who, in the 1850s, was invited to London to join the firm of George Peabody, an American banker who had built one of the most respected merchant banking houses in Britain. When Peabody retired in 1864, Junius took over the firm and renamed it J.S. Morgan & Company. From a modest office in the City of London, he became one of the principal channels through which European capital flowed into American railways, American industry, and American government bonds in the decades after the Civil War. This is the foundation that everything else was built on. The Morgans did not start with American money. They started with English money, German money, Dutch money, the savings of the European propertied class looking for somewhere to grow. And they had a son in New York whose entire career would be built on directing that capital into the American economy on terms that suited the family. John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut. He was educated in Switzerland and at the University of Göttingen in Germany, where he studied mathematics and could have, by his own account, become a professor. Instead, he entered banking. By his early 30s, he was running the New York branch of his father's transatlantic operation. By his 40s, he was the most consequential private banker in the United States. Morgan was an enormous, intimidating man with piercing eyes and a face disfigured by a chronic skin condition that made him reluctant to be photographed. He smoked black cigars constantly. He spoke in short, blunt sentences. He despised small talk. And he understood with a clarity that almost no one else in his industry possessed that the American economy in the late 19th century was a chaotic mass of overcapitalized, badly run, fiercely competing companies that needed to be rationalized by someone with the authority to force compromises that the participants would never accept on their own. That someone, increasingly, was him. The process became known as Morganization. It worked like this. Morgan would identify a critical industry, railways, steel, electricity, that was suffering from ruinous competition between dozens of poorly capitalized firms. He would then convene the executives of those firms, often in his own office, and inform them that they were going to merge. Morgan's bank would underwrite the new consolidated entity. Morgan's people would sit on the board. Morgan would extract a substantial fee for organizing the deal, plus an ongoing position of governance over the resulting business. By the early 1900s, Morgan or his associates sat on the boards of companies that controlled the bulk of American railways, the largest American steelmaker, the dominant American electrical equipment company, and major shares of shipping, insurance, and communications. The most famous example was U.S. Steel. In 1901, Morgan organized the consolidation of dozens of separate steel companies, including Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel, which Morgan personally bought from Carnegie for nearly $500 million, an almost incomprehensible sum at the time, into a single entity called the United States Steel Corporation. It was the first billion-dollar company in human history. It was created by one man, in one transaction, in a private negotiation that the federal government learned about only after the fact. This is the scale at which Morgan operated, not just inside individual industries, but across them. By 1910, a congressional investigation later estimated that Morgan and his immediate partners held more than 70 directorships at companies with combined assets exceeding $22 billion, more than the value of all property west of the Mississippi River. The phrase that the press began to use was the money trust. The methods were not always genteel. In May 1901, Morgan and his rivals fought a brief, savage battle for control of the Northern Pacific Railway that briefly cornered its stock and triggered a stock market panic when speculators who had short-sold the shares discovered they could not buy them back at any price. Several brokerage houses failed. Fortunes were made and unmade in 48 hours. The episode ended only when Morgan and his rival, Edward Harriman, sat down and divided the Western railway system between them. The American railway map was redrawn in a private negotiation between two men. What Morgan was, functionally, was a central bank in a country that had no central bank. The United States had abolished its previous central banking institution in 1836 under President Andrew Jackson, and for nearly 80 years it operated without one. This is an extraordinary fact about American history that is rarely emphasized. The most rapidly industrializing economy on Earth, going through repeated banking panics and currency crises, simply had no institution at the apex of its financial system. There was no lender of last resort. There was no entity that could expand or contract the money supply. There was no body responsible for stabilizing the dollar. What there was, instead, was JPMorgan. In 1895, the U.S. Treasury was running out of gold reserves and faced the prospect of being unable to honor its obligations. President Grover Cleveland negotiated personally with Morgan and August Belmont to organize a private bond issue that would replenish the Treasury's gold. Morgan extracted a substantial profit from the transaction, and the United States avoided a sovereign default through the intervention of two private bankers operating outside any government framework. 12 years later came the Panic of 1907. Several major trust companies had collapsed after speculative losses. Bank runs were spreading. The stock exchange was on the verge of being unable to settle trades. President Theodore Roosevelt's administration had no mechanism to stop the contagion. Morgan, then 70 years old and supposedly retired, returned to his Madison Avenue mansion and convened a series of meetings that lasted for nearly 3 weeks. He locked the heads of the major New York banks in his library and refused to let them leave until they had each pledged a portion of their reserves to a rescue fund. He personally guaranteed loans to keep the New York Stock Exchange operating. He decided which trust companies would be propped up and which would be allowed to fail. When it was over, the panic had been contained. Morgan had stabilized the American financial system through what was essentially a private act of central banking, conducted in his living room, with no legal authority and no public accountability whatsoever. This was the moment at which it became politically untenable for the United States to continue without a central bank. The aftermath of 1907 was the political process that produced the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. In 1910, a small group of bankers, including representatives of the Morgan firm, met in secret on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia to draft the legislation that would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. The drafting was deliberately concealed. The bankers traveled under assumed names. The plan that emerged was substantially the structure of the modern Federal Reserve, a quasi-public, quasi-private central bank with a board of governors and a network of regional reserve banks owned by member commercial banks. The Pujo Committee, a separate congressional investigation that began in 1912, formally documented the extent of the money trust. It published lists of interlocking directorships. It calculated the share of American industry that Morgan and his partners effectively controlled. It produced public outrage that no previous critic of concentrated financial power had been able to generate. There is one biographical detail from the final years of Morgan's life that has always struck people as eerie. He had been booked to sail on the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic in April 1912. The ship was operated by the White Star Line, which Morgan personally controlled through a holding company. He canceled at the last moment. In the same period, he was acquiring art and rare manuscripts at a pace that genuinely embarrassed his descendants. The collection that would become the Morgan Library was assembled in the years immediately before his death. JPMorgan testified before the committee in person in late 1912. He was old, exhausted, and visibly ill. He died less than 4 months later, in March 1913, in Rome. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December of the same year. It is impossible to read these events as coincidence. The system Morgan had operated as a private individual was being formally transferred to a public institution because his death made the absence of a central bank suddenly intolerable. But the Morgan firm did not disappear. It simply moved. J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack, took over the firm at his father's death and presided over it for nearly 3 decades. The Morgan Bank financed the Allied war effort in the First World War. It managed enormous bond issues for European governments. It became, by some measures, the most influential private financial institution in the world during the interwar period. Then came 1929. Then came the Depression. Then came the regulatory backlash. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 forced commercial banks to separate from investment banks. The Morgan firm, which had done both, was forced to split. The commercial banking operation continued under the name JPMorgan & Company. The investment banking partners spun out and formed a new firm in 1935 called Morgan Stanley. From that point onward, there were, in effect, two Morgans, both descended from the same 19th century institution, both still influential, but separated by law and operating in different parts of the financial system. This was the regulatory regime that governed American banking for 66 years. In 1999, the Glass-Steagall restrictions were repealed under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. The wall between commercial and investment banking came down, and one of the institutions that took fullest advantage of the new environment was JPMorgan, which in 2000 merged with Chase Manhattan Bank to become JPMorgan Chase, currently the largest bank in the United States by assets, with more than $4 trillion on its balance sheet. In 2008, when Bear Stearns collapsed, the Federal Reserve organized its emergency sale to JPMorgan Chase for $2 per share, with the Fed itself absorbing the worst of the toxic assets. Later that year, when Washington Mutual failed, JPMorgan Chase acquired its banking operations as well. The bank that emerged from the financial crisis was substantially larger, substantially more dominant, and substantially more central to the U.S. financial system than the bank that had entered it. The pattern, in other words, had not changed. In moments of systemic crisis, the U.S. government still turns to Morgan. The Morgan family as a family has long since faded from operational control of the institutions that bear its name. The descendants of JPMorgan are scattered across philanthropy, academia, and private wealth management. None of them run the bank. But the institutions persist, and they persist on a scale that is extraordinary. JPMorgan Chase had revenues in 2024 of more than $160 billion. Its CEO, Jamie Dimon, is one of the most influential figures in global finance and is regularly mentioned as a possible Treasury Secretary candidate. Morgan Stanley remains one of the most powerful investment banks in the world. The Morgan Library and Museum in New York, built around JPMorgan's private collection of medieval manuscripts, rare books, and old master drawings, is one of the great research libraries of the world. And the structural function that the Morgans invented, the private bank as organizer of capital, consolidator of industry, and stabilizer of last resort, remains the basic architecture of American finance, even as the specific names and ownerships have changed beyond recognition. There is a question that the Morgan story raises that does not have a comfortable answer. In a country without a central bank, someone has to perform the functions of a central bank. The Morgans performed those functions, at scale, for decades. The American economy probably could not have industrialized at the speed it did without that kind of private coordination. The 1907 panic probably could not have been contained without a Morgan in his library on Madison Avenue, forcing competing bankers to cooperate. And yet there is something deeply troubling about the fact that the most consequential financial decisions in the United States were being made, for years on end, by one private individual operating from his living room with no democratic mandate, no public oversight, and no accountability to anyone. The Federal Reserve was created to fix that problem, but the Federal Reserve has not eliminated the underlying pattern. In every major financial crisis since 1913, the central bank has worked closely with, and often through, the same handful of large private banks that once had a Morgan partner on the board. The relationship has changed. The architecture has changed. The fundamental fact that American finance is shaped by the cooperation of a small number of enormously powerful private institutions has not changed. The Morgan name on the building is, in this sense, not historical decoration. It is a reminder that the system we live inside today is in large measure the system Morgan built, slightly modernized, slightly democratized, but recognizable in its essential structure to anyone who studies what he was actually doing during those 3 weeks in the autumn of 1907. The library is still there. The bank is still there. The question of whether any private institution should ever again be allowed to do what Morgan did has been answered, formally, in the negative. Whether it has been answered in practice is a different question entirely.